On the 7th of June 1951, a horrific and brutal war criminal was led out to the gallows for his execution. He was accompanied by American prison guards who helped him up the steps of the scaffold before he was handed over to the executioner, who placed a black cap over his head and secured the noose around his neck. Otto Ohlendorf was a commander in the Einsatzgruppe, the paramilitary death squads that would follow the advances of the German army during the Second World War. It's believed he was personally responsible for the slaughter of over 90,000 people. He and his executioners were ruthless and brutal, and at the end of the conflict, Ohlendorf was brought to trial, and he was condemned and sentenced to death as an evil brute that committed crimes against humanity. But inside of Landsberg Prison, he would meet his end on the gallows. Join us today to look at the execution of the horrific Einsatzgruppe commander, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Otto Ohlendorf was born on the 4th of February 1907, and he grew up inside of a family of farmers. It's assumed that he had a rather normal upbringing, but when he was 18 he joined the Nazi Party and was considered one of the earliest members. Thousands of younger people across Germany began to become attracted to the politics of Hitler and the Nazis, but Ohlendorf the following year joined the SS, and at this time they were not the paramilitary brutal force that they would later become. They were nowhere near as powerful as Hitler's brown shirt CSA. But in the years following, Ohlendorf went to university and studied economics and law, and he also became a doctor of law, and men who had this amount of knowledge, who were also Nazis, would be seen as useful by Hitler. But Ohlendorf threw himself into the Nazi Party's regime as their power over Germany increased, and he taught in Nazi schools in Berlin. He was seen as a good lawyer who often intervened with debates between the SS and other organisations, and in 1937 he joined the SD, the intelligence service of the SS. It was his job to help in the arrest and roundup of those men and women who opposed Hitler, and specifically he was involved in the economic side of the organisation. But Otto Ohlendorf continued to rise throughout the ranks of the SS, and he did gain a number of senior positions and promotions, but he would upset a number of people, and he worked to collect intelligence from secret agents, and some in the Nazi Party disliked his work. This included the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, who once described Otto Ohlendorf as an unbearable Prussian who had no sense of humour. But he was a powerful man inside of the SD, and he continued to carry on the brutal work of the Nazi Party, especially as the persecution of people ramped up across the nation. However, as the Second World War raged across Europe, Ohlendorf was recruited by the head of the SD, Reinhard Heydrich, to carry out a role in which he would be incredibly ruthless and brutal. The man who would be happy sitting behind a desk a lot of the time would now be on the front lines of the Second World War, arranging execution squads, which were known as the Einsatzgruppe. Heydrich appointed Ohlendorf to become the commander of Einsatzgruppe D, and these saw action in the region of the Crimea. The Einsatzgruppe were the horrific death squads that followed the advances of the German army. These SS executioners would round up civilians in a settlement or a small town. They would then sort through the population, then lead those who were to be executed to the edge of a town or a concealed area. Here these people were forced to dig huge pits which would become their graves, and in small groups the civilians were led into the pits, where the executioners would stand on the edge, aiming their rifles at them, then take a fatal shot. Others were led into the pits and were told to lie on the corpses of those before an executioner administered a shot in the back of their necks. It was cold-blooded slaughter, and the Einsatzgruppe were responsible for the slaughter of millions. Ohlendorf's executioners, specifically Einsatzgruppe D, were the smallest of the forces, but they were helped out in their murderous actions by men from other nations, and they continued their slaughter throughout different Soviet lands. His men were attached to the 11th Army. They would follow their advances, and his group were responsible for a massacre in December 1941 at Simferopol, which resulted in over 14,000 people's deaths. In this region where he operated, over 90,000 people were killed by his actions and his unit. Ohlendorf himself did not like the use of the shot of the back of the neck, and he would prefer to order his execution squads to shoot like a normal firing squad from a distance, so that the executioners did not accept as much responsibility for their actions. He banned any contact between the firing squads and the victims, and as many as 3 executioners with their rifles were to shoot one person. He also told his men not to steal any of the victims' property and instigated a military-style execution to the proceedings, and it was one of his executioners that said, "A man is the lord over life and death when he gets an order to shoot 300 children, and he kills at least 150 himself." Otto Ohlendorf was there on the front lines, and he was there witnessing the killing. He was approached by Himmler to use gas fans to slaughter people too, but Ohlendorf stated that his men refused to use them as they found burying the victims too much after. He saw these as impractical and said that it would take too long to kill, but Otto Ohlendorf was a man who was incredibly devoted to the Nazi cause, and he never complained once about the murderous actions. He did, though, once complain about the actions of some of the other soldiers from other nations he was overseeing in his death squads, who were committing scores of atrocities as well as being the executioners. But as well as being responsible for the slaughter squads, Ohlendorf also had other jobs, such as being the Deputy Director General for the Reich Ministry of Economic Affairs. He was seen as a man who would be of use by Hitler, and he even made plans for the future of Germany when he believed the war would be won. However, as the war turned against the Germans, it was clear to Himmler and high-ranking SS members that one day they would be hunted for being barbaric war criminals. Himmler instructed those close to him to obtain false papers and assume new identities, but Ohlendorf was involved in Heinrich Himmler's flight to Flensburg, and he actually was arrested by the British in May 1945, and shortly after this Heinrich Himmler would take his own life after his capture. Ohlendorf was interrogated, and he would during these interviews tell of the horrific actions of the German army in the east, and he was later brought to the Einsatzgruppe Trial. The court proceedings tried to punish those men who were the commanders and leaders inside of the Einsatzgruppe, and they were said to have been responsible for the murders of over 1 million people. Otto Ohlendorf was seen as one of the most powerful defendants, and he was the chief defendant. He also gave evidence that was used against the other war criminals, and was said to have been a reliable source of information. He was a devout Nazi, but he was a man who hated corruption, and he had a strong commitment to his duty. During his trial he claimed that he was a loyal Nazi, and he admitted that he acted properly, and what he had done was not wrong at all. He had no remorse for his actions, and he believed the slaughter he oversaw was justified. Later the prosecutor involved in his trial would outline Ohlendorf's comments, and he said, when Ohlendorf was asked to verify that his unit had murdered 90,000 Jews, the SS general began to quibble. He said he could not confirm it. The reason given was that sometimes his men exaggerated the body count. Would the general care to venture an estimate? No. Was it perhaps 80,000 or over 70,000? That was possible. Or perhaps 100,000? Maybe. And were there many Jewish children amongst those who were killed? Yes, of course. But, added Ohlendorf, he never allowed his men to do as some other units did. He told his men never to use infants for target practice, nor smash their heads against a tree. He ordered his men to allow the mother to hold her infant to her breast and to aim for her heart. That would avoid screaming, and would allow the shooter to kill both mother and child with one bullet. It saved ammunition. Ohlendorf said he refused to use the gas vans that were assigned to his companies. He found that when the mobile killing vehicles arrived at their destination, when they were supposed to dump their asphyxiated corpse into a waiting ditch, some of the captives were still alive and had to be unloaded by hand. His troops had to drag out corpses amid vomit and excrement, and that was very hard on his men, Ohlendorf claimed. At the trial he tried to state that the actions of the Einsatzgruppe were aimed at securing the newly occupied areas, and he claimed it was necessary to make sure that the occupations of these regions went smoothly. But this did not win over the court, and he said that his firing squads were no worse than the press-button killers who dropped the atom bomb on Japan. But for his actions, Otto Ohlendorf was sentenced to death in April 1948. He was transferred to Landsberg Prison to await his execution, and he spent 3 years behind bars before it was time for his date with the executioner. On the 7th of June 1951, he was led out to his prison cell and was accompanied by American military policemen and also a priest, who was there to give him spiritual guidance in his final moments. It was just past midnight, and Ohlendorf was led up to the gallows in the courtyard, and he was then helped up the stairs of the execution device and structure after he had his legs and arms secured behind his back. The executioner, whilst he was on the scaffold, checked some parts of the execution process, and then shuffled him over the trapdoor, and then a photographer took a final image of Otto Ohlendorf, with the executioner and his assistant, and it showed him looking straight at the camera, being very pensive, and he did not appear to show much remorse. The executioner then placed a black cap over his head and then the noose. This was secured, then the trapdoor was released, and instantly Otto Ohlendorf was executed, and he was then placed inside of a coffin after his death was confirmed. Otto Ohlendorf was responsible for the executions of around 95,000 people, and his actions were horrific and ruthless. He had no regard for the men, women and children who the Einsatzgruppe under his command slaughtered, and his crimes were carried out across much of the Eastern Front. He was sentenced to death for his actions following his trial, and at the age of 44 inside of Landsberg Prison on the gallows, Otto Ohlendorf's life came to an end. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.